when the unthinkable happened. Not with a leaked memo, not with a diplomatic cable, but live from the floor of Parliament. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped up to the microphone and, in front of cameras rolling across North America and beyond, did something Washington never saw coming. He didn't plead, he didn't compromise. He simply drew a line and challenged the United States to step over it. For 5 straight weeks, the White House had been turning up the heat. Threats, economic jabs, tariff announcements, all built on one core belief. Canada would eventually cave because Canada always caves, because Canada has no real leverage. But this morning, that belief evaporated on live television. Instead of retreating, Carney flipped the table. In a crisp 2-minute address, calm but unyielding, the Prime Minister handed the United States a deadline. Not a suggestion, not a talking point, a hard deadline. 14 days. That's it. 14 days for Washington to accept a set of non-negotiable terms or face consequences that, in his exact words, would make today's frictions look like a minor disagreement. Let that register. The United States, the nation that has set the global agenda for decades, is now being given ultimatums by Canada. And this isn't happening in secret. It's happening in broad daylight on the record, with the whole world watching. Carney wasn't just speaking to his parliament, he was speaking directly to American leadership and, perhaps more importantly, to everyday Americans. His message was unmistakable. Canada is finished playing defense, finished waiting, finished pretending this is an equal partnership when behind closed doors, it hasn't been treated that way. And here is where the story takes an even sharper turn. This wasn't some off-the-cuff outburst or political grandstanding. Every sentence was measured. Every pause was intentional. Every demand was backed by weeks of quiet preparation. According to sources close to the Prime Minister's office, Canada didn't just wake up this morning and decide to get bold. This has been building behind the scenes, carefully, deliberately, for over a month. So the real question is this: what shifted? What happened in the background that gave Canada the nerve to confront the United States so directly, so publicly, and so aggressively? Because this wasn't merely a speech, it was a power shift. A visible, undeniable change in who holds the leverage. And if Washington misreads this, the fallout won't stay inside the Beltway. It will hit American households where they feel it most: energy bills, job security, and the broader economy. That brings us to the heart of this confrontation. Because Carney didn't just issue a warning, he laid out 5 specific demands. And inside Washington, these are already being called a diplomatic Pearl Harbor. First, the immediate and total removal of all tariffs on Canadian goods. Not reduced, not phased, not renegotiated. Gone. Completely. Carney made it plain that every tariff imposed by the United States is, in Canada's view, a clear violation of USMCA rules. And violations aren't subject to negotiation. They're subject to reversal. No exceptions, no fine print, no stalling. Either they vanish entirely or there's no deal. That's not diplomacy. That's a boundary carved in stone. Second, a formal, legally binding commitment on NORAD and intelligence sharing. And this wasn't a symbolic request. Carney demanded actual signatures from the President, the Secretary of Defense, and the Director of National Intelligence. A written guarantee that joint defense systems stay fully operational, that Five Eyes intelligence sharing resumes without interruption. And most critically, that the United States cannot unilaterally alter the arrangement later. Translation: no more surprises, no more pressure tactics disguised as security adjustments. Third, and this one struck a direct political nerve, Carney demanded a public retraction. A formal White House statement from the president explicitly rejecting any suggestion that Canadian provinces could ever become part of the United States. Think about the gravity of that. Canada is forcing the American president to go on the record and reaffirm its sovereignty, as if that should never have been questioned in the first place. No ambiguity, no loopholes. Say it plainly, or the consequences kick in. Fourth, compensation. Yes, compensation. Carney put a specific number on the table: $14.7 billion. That's what Canada calculates it has lost from tariffs, disrupted supply chains, and forced economic shifts. And he left no room for debate about whether payment is owed, only about how it's delivered. Trade credits, direct payments, infrastructure investments, it doesn't matter. The invoice exists, and the United States is expected to pay it. And finally, the fifth demand, which may carry the longest-term sting, full acknowledgement that Canada controls its own natural resources: oil, natural gas, electricity, critical minerals. Carney made it absolutely clear these are Canadian assets, not bargaining chips for Washington. No more assumptions of guaranteed access. No more behind-the-scenes leverage. If the United States wants those resources, it negotiates like any other partner, fairly, commercially, and as an equal. Now step back and look at the broader picture. These aren't random talking points. They are a systematic dismantling of every pressure point the United States has used against Canada over the past 5 weeks. Trade neutralized, defense leverage locked down, political rhetoric forced into the open, economic damage quantified and billed, resource dependency severed at its root. And here is the detail that has Washington truly on edge. Carney didn't present these as opening bids. There is no next round of talks, no, let's find middle ground. This is the middle ground. Accept all 5 or brace for what follows. Because according to Carney, if even one of these demands is ignored, delayed, or watered down, Canada doesn't negotiate further, it responds. And what he revealed next isn't just a response, it's a full-scale economic counterpunch that could hit the United States faster and harder than anyone in Washington wants to admit. Carney didn't just hint at repercussions. He laid them out step by step, like a menu already prepared. 6 measures, 6 moves that together would strike the United States from every angle. First, a complete halt to energy exports. Not a reduction, not a warning shot, a full stop. Canadian crude oil, natural gas, and electricity shut off immediately, redirected to buyers in Europe and Asia who are eager to take it. Consider what that means. Entire regions of the United States, especially the Midwest and Northeast, rely heavily on Canadian energy flows. Remove that supply, and you're not just looking at higher prices. You're looking at genuine shortages, real and immediate. Second, a full withdrawal from USMCA, the very trade framework that keeps North American commerce moving, torn up once Canada walks away. Trade doesn't stop, but it becomes slower, costlier, and far more hostile. Tariffs snap back under WTO rules. And suddenly, American businesses lose the privileged access they've depended on for years. Supply chains don't just get disrupted, they get completely rewritten. Third, restrictions on airspace and sea lanes. This is where it gets strategic. Carney made it clear that U.S. aircraft, commercial or military, would no longer have automatic entry into Canadian airspace. Every flight would need special approval. At the same time, key maritime routes like the Northwest Passage and the St. Lawrence Seaway would be tightened against U.S.-flagged ships. The result? Longer routes, higher costs, slower deliveries, and a logistical nightmare that worsens by the day. Fourth, financial separation, and this one sent shockwaves through Wall Street. Canada would begin systematically pulling its money out of the United States. No new investments. Pension funds and institutional investors ordered to shed their U.S. holdings over 24 months. Currency controls limiting conversion into U.S. dollars. We're talking about roughly $480 billion in Canadian capital gradually exiting American markets. That's not a dip. That's a structural earthquake. Fifth, full military disengagement. This is the part that made defense officials sit bolt upright. NORAD terminated, joint exercises canceled, Canadian forces withdrawn from U.S. facilities, decades of integrated defense cooperation severed, and instead, Canada pivots toward NATO and its European partners to build independent continental defense systems. That's not just a policy change. That's a strategic realignment of the first order. And sixth, the formation of a coalition, not against an adversary, but against the United States itself. Carney openly stated that Canada is ready to coordinate with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and other democracies to push back against American economic pressure. Shared countermeasures, mutual support, trade and financial systems designed to function without U.S. involvement. Let that sink in. This isn't one country reacting. This is the potential beginning of a coordinated global backlash. And Carney closed that section with a line that wasn't theatrical. It was clinical. These are not warnings, he said. They are promises. In other words, the decision is already made. The plan is already in place. The only question left is whether the United States forces Canada to pull the trigger. So ask yourself this: if even half of these measures take effect, what happens to the American economy? What happens to energy prices, to jobs, to markets already stretched thin? Because while politicians debate, the markets don't wait, and as it turned out, they didn't. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Within minutes of Carney finishing his address, the markets didn't just slip, they panicked. The Dow Jones dropped 1,147 points in the first half hour alone. That's not a routine pullback. That's fear flooding the system all at once. By the close of trading, the S&P 500 had fallen 4.1%, its worst single-day decline since the pandemic era. Investors weren't guessing anymore. They were pricing in a future where Canada actually follows through. Energy stocks took a direct hit. Why? Because traders suddenly had to confront a possibility they never took seriously before, that Canadian oil and gas flows could disappear in less than 2 weeks. Utilities across the Midwest and Northeast started sliding as projections of electricity shortages began circulating. And the financial sector got hammered, because once you start pulling $480 billion out of U.S. markets, that's not volatility. That's a structural shock. And while Wall Street was scrambling, something even more alarming happened on the global stage. Less than 90 minutes after the speech, the European Union stepped in, and they didn't mince words. They backed Canada publicly, clearly, and without hesitation. They called Carney's demands fair and justified, and urged the United States to comply. France, Germany, and the United Kingdom followed immediately with their own statements of support. Think about what that means. This isn't Canada standing alone against the United States. This is Canada standing with the largest economic bloc in the world, and that bloc just signaled it's ready to help. Now shift to Washington, because behind closed doors, the tone was completely different. At the Pentagon, alarms were ringing. Defense officials reportedly convened an emergency session almost instantly. Their concern: NORAD. Because if that system collapses, the consequences aren't abstract. You lose early warning coverage across the Northern Hemisphere. You disrupt coordinated air defense over the Arctic. You weaken intelligence flows that are critical to homeland security. According to internal assessments, rebuilding that kind of integration could take years. Years the United States may not have in a crisis. Inside the White House, the situation wasn't much better. At 10:15 a.m., the National Security Council met in what sources described as a chaotic session. Officials weren't aligned. Some thought Carney was bluffing. Others warned he was deadly serious. Intelligence reports quickly cut through the noise. Canada had been preparing for this moment for 5 weeks. Infrastructure in place, trade partners lined up, contingency plans ready. By noon, the president was briefed by his economic team, and the message wasn't comforting. Even partial implementation of Canada's measures could trigger a recession, energy disruptions, and serious financial instability. When the president reportedly asked whether the U.S. could retaliate harder, the answer he got was stark. There may not be a meaningful way to escalate. Not anymore, because Canada had already moved first. A White House statement came out later that afternoon, firm in tone, but noticeably empty. No counteroffer, no acceptance, no clear strategy. Just words. So here we stand. Markets shaken, allies lining up behind Canada. Defense officials warning of long-term risks, and Washington still trying to figure out whether this is a bluff or a breaking point. Which brings us to the question now hanging over everything. Why 14 days? Why that specific window? And why now? Because make no mistake, that deadline wasn't random. It was chosen with surgical precision to force a decision the United States may not be ready to make. 14 days. Not 13, not 20. 14. That number wasn't picked out of convenience. It was engineered for pressure. 2 full weeks is just long enough that no one in Washington can claim they were caught off guard. There's time to respond, time to negotiate, time to act. But at the same time, it's short enough to block the one tactic politicians fall back on when they're cornered: delay. No endless meetings, no kicking the can down the road, no letting the story fade from the headlines. Every single day inside that window becomes a countdown. The entire world is watching, and the timing is even sharper. March 18th lands midweek, right when markets are fully active, meaning any signal, any rumor, any hesitation gets priced in instantly. On top of that, it hits just before the end of the financial quarter. That means corporations, investors, and executives don't have the luxury of waiting. They need clarity before they report earnings. Pressure doesn't just come from politics. It comes from boardrooms, from shareholders, from the entire economic machine demanding answers. In other words, Carney didn't just set a deadline, he built a trap. Now, as that clock ticks down, three paths are sitting in front of the United States, and none of them are easy. Scenario 1, full compliance. Washington accepts all 5 demands. Tariffs disappear. NORAD gets locked in with formal guarantees. A public statement affirms Canada's sovereignty. Compensation is arranged. Resource control is acknowledged. The crisis ends, but the image damage is massive. On the global stage, it looks like the United States blinked, that it was forced publicly to back down. For an administration built on strength, that's not just a policy loss. That's a political scar that doesn't fade. Scenario 2, partial compliance. Some demands are met, others rejected. Maybe tariffs are lifted, maybe defense cooperation is secured, but compensation is denied, or the sovereignty statement never comes. In that case, Canada doesn't walk away. It responds proportionally. Energy flows get reduced, not cut. Trade agreements unwind gradually, not instantly. The United States avoids total collapse, but still takes a hit economically, strategically, and reputationally. And the relationship becomes fractured, unstable, no longer reliable. And then there's scenario 3, the one no one wants to say out loud: total rejection. March 18th arrives, the deadline passes, and Canada follows through completely. Energy exports stop. NORAD dissolves. Financial separation accelerates. Trade barriers slam into place. Alliances shift. In a matter of weeks, the United States could be facing an energy crisis, a market collapse, and a level of international isolation it hasn't experienced in decades. At that point, the fallout doesn't stay contained. It spills into politics, into Congress, into the streets. You start hearing words like emergency measures, intervention, even constitutional crisis. Because when economic pressure hits that hard, leadership itself comes into question. And that's where we are right now. A ticking clock, a global audience, and a decision that will define not just a dispute, but the future balance of power in North America. Carney has made his choice. Canada has drawn its line. Now the United States has to decide. Does it step back and rebuild a partnership based on respect, or does it push forward and face consequences that are already set in motion? The countdown has already begun. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe to my channel for daily updates.